1956, Pinewood Studios, Buckinghamshire. The world's biggest movie star stood under blazing film lights, surrounded by 100 crew members, holding their breath in uncomfortable silence. Laurence Olivier, England's greatest living actor and the film's director, stared at Marilyn Monroe with barely concealed frustration building behind his aristocratic features. They had just filmed the same scene for the 17th time that afternoon, and the tension crackling through the soundstage had become so thick you could cut it with a knife. Then Olivier said the words that would define one of Hollywood's most notorious production nightmares, words that would echo through film history for decades to come and perfectly capture the impossible gulf between two completely different worlds colliding on a single British film set. He leaned forward, his theatrical training keeping his voice measured but his meaning unmistakable, and told Monroe with devastating condescension, "All you have to do is be sexy, Marilyn." In that single moment, something snapped on the set of The Prince and the Showgirl, and what was already a troubled production exploded into an all-out war between method acting and classical theater tradition, between Hollywood glamour and British aristocracy, between a vulnerable woman fighting for creative control and a legendary director who believed he knew better. But here's what almost nobody talks about when they retell this famous Hollywood story, the detail that transforms it from simple celebrity gossip into something far more revealing about power, gender, and the brutal machinery of fame in the 1950s. If you appreciate deep dives into Hollywood's most fascinating untold stories, please subscribe to this channel. We're uncovering the real history behind the legends, one frame at a time. To understand how The Prince and the Showgirl became one of cinema's most infamous production disasters, you have to go back to what it represented for Marilyn Monroe in the summer of 1956. This wasn't just another film role, this was her declaration of independence from a Hollywood system that had treated her like a beautiful piece of machinery designed to follow orders and look pretty for the camera. Monroe had done something almost unheard of for a female star in that era. She had formed her own production company, Marilyn Monroe Productions, to seize control of her career and prove she was more than just another sex symbol manufactured by studio executives. She had purchased the film rights to Terence Rattigan's stage play The Sleeping Prince with her own money, chosen to adapt it for the screen, and personally invited Laurence Olivier, one of the most respected actors in the English-speaking world, to both direct and co-star opposite her. Monroe arrived in London that July as both the star and the producer of a major international production, flying into Heathrow Airport with her new husband, the celebrated playwright Arthur Miller, and dreams of being taken seriously as an artist finally within her grasp. The British press went absolutely wild for her arrival, photographers swarming the airport in numbers that shocked even jaded American reporters, and the excitement building around this transatlantic collaboration seemed to promise something truly magical. Here was Hollywood glamour meeting British theatrical prestige, America's most famous actress working with England's most distinguished actor-director, all wrapped up in a romantic comedy about a showgirl who captivates a prince during the coronation festivities of 1911 London. On paper, it looked like the perfect recipe for both critical and commercial success. But from the moment filming began at Pinewood Studios on August 7, 1956, it became clear that something had gone terribly, catastrophically wrong with this dream collaboration. The fundamental problem came down to a clash of philosophies so profound that no amount of goodwill or professionalism could bridge the gap. Laurence Olivier represented everything that British culture held sacred about the performing arts. He was classically trained at the finest theatrical institutions, he had commanded Shakespeare on London's greatest stages, and he approached acting with the disciplined precision of a master craftsman who believed that technique, preparation, and director's authority were the holy trinity of great performance. To Olivier, acting was about showing up on time, learning your lines perfectly, hitting your marks with mathematical precision, and delivering exactly what the director requested without unnecessary drama or delay. Monroe, on the other hand, had become deeply committed to method acting through her studies at the Actors Studio in New York, working with Strasberg and absorbing a completely different philosophy that emphasized emotional truth over technical execution. For Monroe, acting wasn't about mechanical precision, it was about finding something real and vulnerable inside herself and bringing it to the surface, even if that process was messy, unpredictable, and sometimes required dozens of takes before she felt she had captured something authentic. These two approaches to performance were not just different, they were fundamentally incompatible, and when you forced them to coexist on a single film set with egos and reputations on the line, you created a recipe for absolute disaster. Paula Strasberg was officially listed in the production credits as Marilyn Monroe's dramatic coach, but that bland title didn't come close to capturing her actual role on the set of The Prince and the Showgirl, or the chaos her presence created from day one of filming. Paula was the wife of Lee Strasberg, the legendary acting teacher who had become Monroe's mentor and father figure, and Monroe had insisted that Paula be hired as part of the production with one of the highest salaries on the entire crew. Every single day of production followed the same maddening pattern that drove Olivier closer and closer to a complete breakdown. He would carefully explain to Monroe how he wanted a scene performed, drawing on his decades of experience directing some of the finest actors in British theatre, describing precisely where she should move, how she should deliver her lines, what emotional tone he was looking for in the moment. Monroe would listen politely, sometimes nodding as if she understood and agreed with his direction, and then the instant Olivier finished speaking, she would turn away from him and look directly at Paula Strasberg, who stood just off camera in her dark clothes, like some mysterious oracle whose approval was the only thing that truly mattered. Paula would give Monroe a subtle nod or shake her head almost imperceptibly, and Monroe would either follow Olivier's direction or completely ignore it based entirely on Paula's nonverbal signal. The crew watched this power struggle play out dozens of times every single day, and their initial confusion quickly transformed into frustration and resentment as shooting schedules collapsed and budgets spiraled out of control because nobody could definitively answer the question burning in everyone's mind. Who was actually directing this film? Laurence Olivier or Paula Strasberg? The situation became so toxic that Olivier eventually reached his breaking point and confronted Monroe directly, demanding that Paula be removed from the set entirely. Monroe refused absolutely, making it clear that Paula's presence was non-negotiable and that if Olivier wanted her to continue with the production, he would have to accept that Paula was part of the package. If you want to understand just how dysfunctional the set became, there's one scene that perfectly captures the madness, and it involved 20 jars of expensive caviar being destroyed over the course of 2 full days of shooting. The scene should have been simple, just Monroe's character enjoying an elegant moment during a formal dinner, the kind of sequence that experienced film crews could knock out in a few hours before breaking for lunch. Olivier set up the shot, explained what he wanted from Monroe, and called for the first take. Monroe performed the scene, Olivier called cut, and then Paula Strasberg shook her head slightly, indicating that the take wasn't acceptable. Monroe immediately requested that they shoot it again, despite the fact that to everyone else on set, including Olivier himself, the take had been perfectly fine. They reset, brought out a fresh jar of caviar, and filmed the scene again with Monroe making subtle adjustments that were virtually imperceptible to anyone, except perhaps Paula. This pattern repeated over and over, each failed take burning through another jar of expensive caviar, another hour of crew time, another chunk of the production budget, while Olivier's famous composure began to crack like fine china, under too much pressure. When the scene finally wrapped after 34 separate takes and 20 jars of destroyed caviar, the production had burned through nearly half a week's budget on a sequence that would last less than 30 seconds in the finished film, and the relationship between England's greatest theatrical actor and Hollywood's biggest sex symbol had deteriorated beyond any hope of professional repair. The caviar scene was not an isolated incident, but rather a perfect distillation of the daily chaos that defined the entire production. Monroe's pattern of arriving late to set became so predictable that crew members started placing bets on exactly how many hours behind schedule she would be on any given day. Some mornings, Monroe would arrive 3 hours late without explanation or apology, walking onto the soundstage as if nothing was unusual, while dozens of highly paid technicians and actors had been standing around waiting for her. Other days, she wouldn't show up at all, claiming illness or exhaustion that effectively shut down the entire day's work. The line memorization problems became almost as legendary as the lateness, with Monroe struggling to remember her dialogue even for relatively simple scenes and requiring take after take to finally deliver her lines as written. Olivier, who came from a theatrical tradition where actors were expected to have their lines memorized perfectly before ever setting foot on stage, found this particularly infuriating because to him it represented a fundamental lack of professionalism. But here's where the story gets complicated, where it transforms from a simple narrative about a difficult actress into something much more interesting about different definitions of excellence and the price that great art sometimes demands. When The Prince and the Showgirl finally premiered in June of 1957, something remarkable happened that nobody who had suffered through the filming could have predicted. Critics who had heard whispers about the troubled production and were expecting to write dismissive reviews found themselves confronting a performance that was charming, funny, emotionally nuanced, and completely captivating on screen. The woman who had required 34 takes to eat caviar convincingly, who had shown up hours late and forgotten her lines and driven Olivier to the brink of a nervous breakdown, had somehow produced work that glowed with star power and genuine acting talent. Every ounce of the chaos and conflict that had plagued the set was completely invisible in the finished film, replaced by a performance that made Monroe look effortlessly natural and proved that her instincts about what worked on camera were absolutely correct, even when they contradicted everything that Olivier's classical training told him should work. The reviews praised Monroe's comic timing, her vulnerability, her ability to hold her own opposite one of the greatest actors in the English-speaking world. Olivier himself, despite his private feelings about the nightmare production experience, was forced to admit publicly that Monroe had been right about her performance choices and that the method approach that had seemed so self-indulgent and wasteful during filming had actually produced superior results on screen. Years later, Olivier would say that working with Monroe had taught him something important about the difference between theatrical acting and film acting, and that her instinctive understanding of the camera was something that all his classical training had never fully prepared him to appreciate. The conflict on the set of The Prince and the Showgirl was never really about caviar scenes or memorized lines or Paula Strasberg's presence. It was about power and control and who gets to define what greatness looks like in the performing arts. Olivier represented an old guard that believed directors were generals and actors were soldiers who followed orders, that classical training and theatrical discipline were the only legitimate paths to great performance. Monroe was fighting a much bigger battle than just one difficult production. She was trying to prove that a woman dismissed as just another blonde bombshell could be taken seriously as an artist, that she deserved creative control over her own work, and that her instincts about performance were valid even when they contradicted what powerful men with impressive credentials told her she should do. The formation of Marilyn Monroe Productions was itself a revolutionary act in 1950s Hollywood, when female stars were expected to sign studio contracts that gave them almost no control over their roles, their images, or their careers. By arriving in London as both star and producer, Monroe was attempting to fundamentally change the power dynamics that had defined her entire career, refusing to be just another pretty face following directions and instead demanding to be treated as a creative equal with legitimate artistic vision. This fundamental misreading of the power dynamics created a toxic situation where every disagreement became a battle not just over how to perform a scene, but over much bigger questions about who had the right to make creative decisions and whose definition of excellence should prevail. Looking back at The Prince and the Showgirl from the perspective of nearly 70 years later, what's most striking is how the production serves as a perfect encapsulation of all the contradictions and complexities that defined Marilyn Monroe's career and public image. Here was a woman with genuine talent and artistic ambition who created chaos wherever she went, someone who fought desperately for creative control while simultaneously seeming unable to handle basic professional responsibilities like showing up on time and learning her lines. She was a vulnerable person struggling with psychological demons who also wielded enormous power as one of the biggest stars in the world, someone who demanded to be taken seriously as an artist while leaning heavily on a drama coach whose presence made it impossible for directors to work with her effectively. The Prince and the Showgirl production represented Monroe at a pivotal moment in her career, genuinely trying to seize control and prove herself as more than just a sex symbol, while simultaneously displaying all the behaviors that would eventually contribute to her tragic early death just 6 years after this film wrapped. Neither Monroe nor Olivier was entirely right or entirely wrong, which is what makes this story so enduringly fascinating and what keeps people arguing about it decades later. The story of The Prince and the Showgirl, set in the summer and fall of 1956, is ultimately about what happens when incompatible worldviews collide under the intense pressure of a major film production, when brilliant but difficult people are forced to collaborate despite having completely different ideas about how art should be created. It's about the price that genius sometimes demands, the chaos that innovation often requires, and the question of whether the ends justify the means when the means involve destroyed schedules, blown budgets, and relationships damaged beyond repair. Most of all, it's about Marilyn Monroe's desperate struggle to be taken seriously in an industry that wanted to keep her in a box labeled sex symbol and never let her grow beyond that limiting definition. The Caviar scene, with its 34 takes and 20 destroyed jars and 2 full days of production time, stands as a perfect symbol of what this fight looked like in practical terms. Monroe refusing to settle for what everyone else thought was good enough because she was searching for something more, something truer, something that would prove she was a real artist, even if pursuing that vision drove everyone around her absolutely crazy. Did she find what she was looking for? Watch The Prince and the Showgirl and decide for yourself. The luminous performance she delivered on screen suggests that maybe, just maybe, all that chaos and conflict and destroyed Caviar was worth it after all. But also ask yourself what it means that Monroe had to fight so hard for what male actors of her generation were simply granted as a matter of course: the respect, the creative freedom, the assumption that maybe they knew what they were doing, even when their process looked messy from the outside. That's the real story of The Prince and the Showgirl, not just a tale of two difficult celebrities failing to get along, but a window into the systemic forces that made Monroe's career both brilliant and tragic, and a reminder that the battles she fought on that British film set in 1956 are still being fought in different forms by women in entertainment today.